Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here to chair this session, the first session on preventing firearm violence in communities and schools. I want to thank Rebecca, Mark, Pat, Lainey, Lynn, and all your team. You've done a really marvelous job in getting all of us here together. So for those of you who are in the room and those who are watching us online, I think it's no secret that the entire communities in our nation are affected by firearm violence directly or indirectly. And in using the term violence, I'm referring to the broad typology of violence, including interpersonal, self-directed, and collective. So in the next hour, in this first session, you will hear about things like youth violence, suicide prevention, school shootings, mass shootings, and maybe throughout the day, those themes will also be repeated again. I think the statistics that Dr. Erardi mentioned and showed were, they were so powerful that probably I don't have much to add. I would just say that, Justin is going to talk to you about issues of school shootings, but to just give you some numbers, based on some estimates, more than 200,000 students have been affected by school shootings since Columbine. While definitional challenges exist about, what really is a school shooting or what is really a mass shooting, the reality is that no matter how you look at it, the number of children who have been injured or killed during school shootings, for example, is really, really a high number, around 400 or 500 students since Columbine. And that is just incidents in which there was at least one injury. The number of threats and carrying guns to schools, all of that is really probably much more, and their impact is not well understood. So we are going to have 4 fantastic speakers today. Dr. Cheryl King from University of Michigan, who will talk about firearm safety strategy for rural communities. Dr. Jesenia Pizarro from Arizona State University, criminology and criminal justice, who will talk about busy streets using diminishing physical and social disorder as a tool for firearm violence prevention. Dr. Justin Heinze of University of Michigan will talk to you about some of the really exciting multi-level work that they are doing in terms of school climate interventions. And then lastly, you will hear from Dr. Joe Erardi, who I'm really, really happy and pleased to be in this panel as one of our stakeholders, who has been a school superintendent for about more than 2 decades. And he will talk to you about some of the lessons we have learned since the Sandy Hook tragedy. Each of us will talk about 10 minutes. We will not take questions immediately after each talk, so the people will present back to back. And then as Dr. Cunningham mentioned, at the very end, we have built about 10-15 minutes for all the questions that you have.
Good morning. This is the right sequence, so thanks to our panel chair for setting it up this way. So we've heard a lot of really rich information already this morning about firearm statistics, research programs and priorities, the NIH research funding opportunities, and we're definitely going to go down now even more into the trees and talk about one particular project, which is an initiative to develop a firearm safety education program for rural communities. And these are short. I'm going to take this opportunity to tell you about just one slice of this developing project, and it's the first slice, and I think our team would say probably the most important slice. And that is to be sure that going forward, the research that we do is tailored to the community that we're working in, that we've heard voices from the community, and that the way we approach the research and the questions we ask and the data we collect will all be meaningful to this community as we move forward and actually develop a firearm safety education program. So the objective here is to develop and pilot it. This is a one-year project that we hope will continue into a longer-term program of research, with larger scale studies. But what we're trying to do is figure out what is the most appropriate for our community message what type of firearm safety message, what are the components, the content of the education we want to deliver, who are the most appropriate messengers in the rural communities to deliver the message, and what is the messaging strategy? Is this watching YouTubes? Is it doing a decision aid? Is it handing out information sheets? Is it public lectures at school, or some combination of the above? We're doing this work in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. As you probably know, Michigan is surrounded by Great Lakes. The Upper Peninsula is really upper. One of our community members of the team made the drive down yesterday, and I think it was the day of the drive. It is quite a distance away and extremely rural on the whole. So it's nearly a third of the land of Michigan and a very small percent of the population. And just to give you an idea of community partners, and I know this is a small font list, so the particulars aren't important so much as to share that we have a really broad representation from the community, from the police to state trooper community members to mental health to the schools. And these are not the people we'll be doing the focus groups with, but our community partners to figure out what questions to ask in the focus groups, to figure out what resources to share with the focus groups to get their input on, and even who and all should we be sure to include. And what are we going to be doing in terms of things we want to be sure we do get from our community partners before we go forward? Well, one is when we approach working in our focus groups, what questions are even reasonable to ask? We don't want to offend. We want to gain a lot of information. What has already been tried in the community? What do you think would be helpful? What do you currently teach your children about firearm safety? How does your community think about firearm safety? What have been the barriers to firearm safety in your community? So really learning, for instance, not to ask in the focus groups, how many firearms do you own? And so that's one of the messages we learned. Don't begin a focus group and ask everyone in the group to share how many firearms they own and the types of firearms. It's really just figuring out how to approach this. In terms of focus group probes and participants, have we included them all? And we talked about including one for people who may be veterans, police, people who are working in the sheriff's department. There may be one for people who are teaching firearm safety, who are selling firearms, people from schools. We definitely want to hear from families. And then looking at those materials, we can only show so many in a focus group. There are a lot of existing materials to kind of figure out which are the ones to go forward with. And I just want to share just a few things just to give you a sampling of some of what we've learned so far. I mentioned they definitely tailored our focus group questions. We went in with a draft of what these would be, and we received some really good input on how to revise these questions and approach it differently, more from a values perspective. What to ask and not ask, I mentioned who to ask. They have recommended that we go a bit younger. We were planning a middle school and a high school focus group. Now we're also, on their recommendation, considering an upper elementary school focus group to learn what children say they are learning in their families and how their families approach it. One can get a hunting license in Michigan beginning at the age of 10. You can also hunt with a gun at the ages 8 and 9 with a parent and someone who has a license. So really, beginning in middle school is late in a hunting community. Some of the materials, and I think this is one that really struck us. You may be familiar with this one. I believe this is from the American Academy of Pediatrics firearm safety handout. There was a fairly rapid response to this informational bit, and it was not positive. And I pulled out the one on the top left is what they liked best. The one on the top least, they disliked. And the one on the bottom left, they actually did like. But the top left, how did they see that? Now, if you think of it from this community perspective, you can probably guess. You're telling me I'm not as good a parent as someone else if I have a firearm in my home. And there are firearms in most homes in these, not all, but many homes in these communities. So to put it out there that the safest home for children and teens is one without guns was very off-putting. Did not see that as being useful, as wanting to look further at this handout. However, the one on the bottom left, which is factual, relates more to safety, was fine. People thought that was useful and would be helpful for people in their community to see. So, it's many different kinds of information we put in front of them. We receive this kind of rich information. Here's one that is from our Injury Prevention Center. What they really liked here on this page of this, I think the first page was more statistics. Statistics were seen as fine, but not so many. But what did they really like? Practical information. This was very positively received. That you're not just telling me what bad is going to happen, what I'm not doing right as a parent. You're telling me what I can do to keep my child safer. And a very strong value on firearm safety in the communities we were in. A lot of pride about a firearm education and safety. And here, and I understand now, people are beginning to question, and we need to learn more, what really is safe firearm storage. But the idea that they're given a website and information was viewed very positively. This is one that some people were familiar with. This is the National Shooting Sports Foundation or Federation. And this is actually a several-page magazine. And although it's a lot of information, people saw it as really very good information. And it has ideas about safe storage, very positive. The other thing I can say about this National Shooting Sports Foundation is their website. They have a partnership now with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. They have a video about firearm safety approaches on their website, and they have additional materials about firearms and suicide prevention. So again, this was seen as more culturally tailored than some of the other materials. And then an idea that came from our community partners is that we needed perhaps to focus less on developing new materials coming out of our universities and institutes, and more on putting the firearm safety messages into the materials they access regularly in their community. And this was an example that someone who was so invested in this topic, he attended all 3 of our community meetings that were in different towns. At the 3rd meeting, he brought this forward and really found his voice to share the recommendation that we look at things that are currently being distributed widely, such as this, when people get their hunting license, and there's other examples too, and work on getting our message into these materials. I just wanted to put the names up of all these folks who gave us a great deal of input, and of course, thanks to my co-lead, Cindy Ewell-Foster, Sarah Derwin, who is our person making it happen in the Upper Peninsula and was able to join us today, and all of the other faculty team members. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cheryl, for that really great presentation. So the next speaker is going to be Dr. Justin Heinze of University of Michigan School of Public Health. And Justin will talk about some really exciting, multifaceted, multi-level work that they are doing in schools.
The on button. This clicker's probably a bad idea anyways because I'm going to wander. If I start to drift and you can't hear me, just somebody kind of point this way and I'll make my way back to the microphone. I was listening to the statistics this morning, and I anticipated hearing those statistics, and they're very sobering. And it often draws my attention away to the injury and mortality that is related to firearms, and that's incredibly important. But I also feel it can sometimes force us to overlook the subtler ways that firearm violence can affect some health disparities. And as an educator, I'm an educational psychologist by training.
Justin, for the live stream, I want you closer to the microphone.
All right. I'll just put this clicker down, so then I'll definitely stay here. As an educational psychologist, I'm interested in the learning environment. I want to know, how do schools affect long-term health disparities? And so when we think about your vision of a school, what kind of learning environments are we creating for our students, our young learners? Do they look like this? Big windows, collaboration, transfer of knowledge, or are they starting to look more and more like this, where the threat and security that's related to violence, that's related to firearms, are salient enough where they're changing some of the outcomes and expectations for our students? And I've had an opportunity to speak to stakeholders all throughout the country. And the things that I hear from them, this one in particular, this is about 8 miles away from Sandy Hook Elementary. Look at the quote. Since the shooting, we've been learning how to hide. You don't see reading, writing, and arithmetic here. You see a preoccupation with safety. And how does that influence our learners? How are we drawing attention away from academics that might in turn create disparities down the line? And for a long time, when I thought about safety as from a broader perspective, I took the firearms out of the equation because, yes, firearms are a huge issue, but oftentimes when we think about the many different ways that people can get injured or hurt within schools, we need to think about what happens on a daily basis, the microaggressions that are happening, the emotional and psychological violence that might be happening, the bullying and intimidation. And for those of you who sat through Psychology 100, you probably recognize Maslow's hierarchy. You need to have these basic foundational pieces in place before you can self-actualize yourself as a learner. You need to have the physiological needs met. You need to have feelings of safety, and you need to feel like you belong. Again, before you can move up and really create a learning environment that's going to help everyone reach their full potential. And this pans out in the literature. I don't have the citations up here, but essentially you see some of these basic safety and belonging needs manifesting themselves through negative outcomes. How does connectedness play out in terms of internalizing behavior? The connections that we see between peers and teachers are associated with deviant behavior, ostracism, school climate in general, and how that milieu that we're creating for students can affect all of these outcomes that, again, lead to disparities. And for that reason, I often decoupled the kind of work that I do in promoting school safety away from firearms. But the more and more I learn about this field and the more I'm engaging with stakeholders and other researchers, is all of these things can be antecedents. They can be precursors to the event where a firearm is present. You might not see firearms up on this slide yet, but down the road, each of these pieces can play a part in promoting or potentially preventing firearm violence. And so I've been excited to work with the Sandy Hook Promise Foundation over the last about 4 years to test their suite of programs that are designed to look at more upstream predictors of firearm violence. So they have 2 key programs. One is Start with Hello. The The principle is pretty straightforward. You're trying to promote connectedness. You're trying to promote student engagement. It sounds easy in theory to walk into a hallway to say hello, to sit down at a table and invite someone who might seem like they're alone to be part of the conversation. It's easy to do now when we're adults, maybe. It's not so easy to do when you're a middle school student. It's not so natural to do as an elementary school student. So they've created a curriculum. They've created paraphernalia. They've created promise clubs where people can engage in activities that are designed to create that inclusivity. What a wonderful idea to make the environment a more welcoming place. And maybe that starts to diminish some of the ostracism and some of the loneliness that you might see within your school environments. Say Something is the second piece of their suite of programmings. It's a fairly familiar refrain. If you were at Detroit Metro Airport this morning or yesterday, you hear this message being shouted out over the loudspeakers. If you see something, say something. We often believe there's this innate ability in each one of us to recognize someone who might be suffering, to recognize someone who might be in crisis, to recognize if someone might be a danger to themselves or others. This program is designed to teach this explicitly to the students at schools, to the teachers at schools, to parents as well. Because oftentimes, in retrospect, when someone has committed self-inflicted violence or they've committed an act of violence at schools, people will talk about, we saw those signs. We recognized those warning symptoms. It was either through social media. It was through their schoolwork. It was because we just thought they were a teenager and acting moody. Who knows what that might be? But can we explicitly, again, teach these messages so that students then can recognize that someone might be suffering. Second, importantly, that they have the self-efficacy and confidence to reach out. Again, it's not something that's natural to us. We think someone might be suffering. Are we brave enough to stand up and tell a teacher, tell a trusted adult that person might be suffering, understanding that there could be consequences for you or for that individual as well, and then ultimately creating those avenues. Again, easy in theory to think about, I can say something, but do I have a trusted adult with whom I could converse about these things? Is there a platform for me to report this information? All right, and so it's the combination of these two programs that we believe might manifest in a reduction of some of these long-term harms. So what we believe is if you implement these programs with fidelity, you might see some initial changes in just some of these basic first steps. And this is based on models from public health, like a health belief model. If we talk to Cheryl, you'll see these initial behavioral change models. You don't go from presenting information to behavioral change like that. It's not like switching on a light switch. It's more like turning an oil tanker. It takes a little bit of time, and you have to have some of these preliminary steps. Where you build in some of that self-efficacy, some of those avenues to report. We believe by doing that, you're not only going to start to see a change in the climate of these schools where people are encouraged to be inclusive, where people are encouraged to reach out and help those individuals that might be a risk to themselves or others, but then also have an influence on some of those long-term outcomes. Now, I feel that there is an energy and excitement about this field moving forward and moving quickly. I'm focusing, and my colleagues are focusing, we have a few of them in the room, Mary, Mark, Andy. We want to take time and develop an evidence base to make sure that what seems obvious, I present the information, you now have the knowledge and ability to report. I want to make sure that that piece is solid first before we ever start to attribute some of these later pieces back to our behavioral change. And so a lot of the work that we've been doing is trying to make these foundational connections, because there are so many programs that are existing in schools now that don't have a lot of evidence to suggest their efficacy. So is it a good idea to promote inclusivity? Is it a good idea to tout the message, see something, say something? It was at the Metro in Chicago. It's at Detroit Metro Airport. Does it make sense to include in schools? I don't see a lot of evidence out there to say that one way or another that this is the path that we should be following. And this is too important of an issue for parents, for students, for all those that are engaged within the broader stakeholder perspective to not make sure that this foundational piece works first. And so we have a couple of pilot studies, and again, we're trying to build that evidence base. So starting in 2017, this was kind of a non-equivalent control group design. We had about 20 schools in Los Angeles County, Los Angeles Intermediate or Unified School District, as well as a couple charter schools. This was a convenient sample. We were looking for schools to participate. We had middle schools, we had high schools, and we were just going to do a basic kind of pre-test, post-test to see whether or not we started to see some initial changes in some of these outcomes. We really wanted to look at some of the implementation and fidelity of the programming itself and then see kind of where we're starting. We learned a lot from this study that kind of informed our next pilot study where, again, we're pushing up the rigor. Now we're trying to introduce a randomized controlled trial. We are still following the same kind of pre-test, post-test model. We learned from the initial pilot study that inclusivity message, that start with hello message, got lost a little bit with our high schoolers. It was the middle schoolers that seemed to really internalize that message and want to think about it. So we now are focusing on what we believe is the population most of interest, most primed for these interventions. And then we're also integrating some administrative data and archival data. So from that very first one, we see that first piece, that very first step might be happening. You implement the program, and there was some variability in the fidelity with which the program was implemented at every school. I mean, this is kind of a cluster design, so there's always going to be a little bit of variation there. But this important caveat is that this really worked for those that were exposed to the program, and this informs this next study and our future studies moving forward. The program exposure is designed as a universal strategy. This is not targeted or indicated strategies. These are universal strategies that are supposed to filter down. But it did make a big difference if they were really actively engaged with the programming. Now we introduce the RCT. All pilots have their own little flubs here and there. This one just happened to be co-occurring with a teacher strike in LA. So I don't know how much a teacher strike, so for my 622, my evaluation students in the room, this could be a threat to the internal validity. But that did happen. But we even with that strike, even with some of the caveats that I would have to introduce and be happy to talk to folks about, we still saw those first steps. That self-efficacy to report, that knowledge about reporting signs, it seems to be coming up. All right? We are going to spend a lot more time thinking about what engagement and what kind of that dose-received idea means. And so in this second pilot study, we collected a lot about how much they interacted with the program, how much did they engage with the program. So really kind of driving deep into what it means to experience this program, and then can we attribute sort of these the behavioral outcomes to that engagement. So do we see some of that same kind of program engagement interaction effect? And again, I'm happy to talk with anybody about some of the results in more depth. Now move to yet another body of evidence that we hope to create over the next 3 years. This is funded by the National Collaborative for Gun Violence Research. We have 21 of 24 schools on board. Again, in LA, we are going to randomly assign 12 schools to each condition. And now we want to see if we can sustain that effect. Can we see a sustainment of those initial changes, one, over the course of the study period, but then can we also start to see some of the behavioral change? So my time is up, but I will be happy to answer any questions after. There we go. All right.
Sure. Thank you very much, Justin. So as Rebecca has mentioned, one of the main powers of the FACTS Consortium is to bring people from different disciplines together. So we have epidemiologists, psychologists, psychiatrists, and people with education, doctoral education in education as a discipline. Next, you're going to hear from a criminologist, Dr. Jesenia Pizarro from Arizona State University. We'll be talking about some exciting work in physical and social disorder.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I have to say that as a criminologist, I'm very excited to be here, and I'm very excited to be learning from all of your work and also building bridges. And because we all have the common goal, right? Save lives, create safer communities. And what better way to do that than all working together and playing to our strengths. So today, I'm going to be presenting preliminary results from one of the FACTS-funded pilot projects, the Busy Streets Project. And Busy Streets is rooted on crime prevention through environmental design. Crime prevention through environmental design posits that you can have a positive effect on crime, a reduction in crime, by manipulating the environment. And there are many ways that you can manipulate this environment. Things like increasing lighting, trimming landscape. Those are all types of crime prevention through environmental design. But what we're focusing here is on greening, which is a form of crime prevention through environmental design. And greening refers to the beautification and maintenance of blighted properties. And this could take many forms. It could take mowing, the form of mowing. It could take the form of cleaning the debris, creating community gardens, and planting vegetation. Theoretically, when we look at this, and I'm looking at this mostly from a criminological point of view, the whole notion that this might work is based on the idea that you're fixing broken windows, and that in doing so, you're increasing collective efficacy and social capital within the community. And by fixing broken windows, we're referring to this whole idea that if you fix smaller problems within a community, you're going to prevent bigger ones from occurring. And the reason that this would occur is because you're sending out the message to would-be offenders that this is not a welcoming place for you. The community cares about the environments, and if you come in here and you act up, then somebody's going to do something about it. You're not going to get away with it. Collective efficacy is very related to this, and this whole idea of building social capital and the willingness of residents to come together in the community to solve community problems. So it's a sign that you fix those broken windows. But in essence, what that also creates is busy streets. And by busy streets, I'm referring to this whole idea of creating more traffic within the community. And why would creating more traffic and more foot traffic and more people being out and about is important? Well, it increases guardianship. Again, if you're thinking of your average rational offender, if there's more guardianship, they're not going to go in to offend in these places because of the odds of getting caught and getting apprehended. Now, there's been a lot of work recently in the area of greening, and I admittedly forgot to put my references here, but I know that a lot of this work have been conducted by people who are sitting in this room, so I do acknowledge you. But what the work here has told us is that greening as a whole serves to decrease overall crime, specific types of crime. We know that greening is also related to perceptions of crime and reductions in fear of crime, but that it also increases collective efficacy and social capital within communities. And we build on this work by examining the effect that greening has on crime within our work. So our work was conducted in Flint, and we did a quasi-experiment where we looked at 3 different treatments. Well, 2 actual treatments and a no treatment. We had community engaged screening, which refers to instances where community members self-initiated and came together to mow and beautify vacant lots within the city of Flint. It is important to note that these efforts have been underway, the community greening in itself have been underway in Flint for years before we started. Then we have the professional mowers, and that is in those treatments areas which were randomly assigned, we actually paid a professional mowing company to come in and do the treatment of mowing and beautifying. And then we had the no mow, where nothing occurred. Really quickly, we hypothesized that the greening treatments was going to have a crime reduction effect in the treatment in the areas that received treatment, and we also hypothesized that the community engaged greening treatment was going to be more robust. It was going to have more robust effect. Our main outcome was firearm crime incidents, and we did some fancy modeling. So if fancy modeling questions come, I'm going to point it to the person that did the fancy modeling in this table. So although our main variable of interest was firearm crime, we did do some analysis on overall crime. And what we find here, in a nutshell, is that the treatment effect did serve to suppress the seasonal peaks that we were expecting during the late spring to early fall months. So if you see 2015, you see that they were high. During that same time in 2016, you see a reduction. The pattern is pretty similar when we actually looked at firearm offenses. It might not look as pronounced because we had a smaller number of cases within the area. Of course, a model cannot be missing, so we modeled it. And in essence, what this model tells us is that prior to the treatment, both the community engaged and the professional mole areas had higher crime rates than the treatment, than the control area, and that there was higher neighborhood disadvantage. Interestingly, contrary to our hypothesis, we found that it did have, if you look at the interaction effect, we did find a decrease, but only a statistical significant decrease with the professional mowing. And we think that the reason for this is that community engaged mowing group have been working in Flint for years prior to our intervention. So there was some contamination going on. And that's just a fancy figure that shows the Model 3, if you want to see how the direction of the findings. In summary, what we found was that greening is in fact associated with the suppression of seasonal firearm crime spikes, as we expected. However, our second hypothesis was not supported, as we did not find that community engaged groups had a statistically significant difference. Although there was a reduction, but it almost made statistical significance. If it counts, it was almost statistically significant. It just didn't. It was 0.057. We only needed to go to 0.05. We then would have talked about it. But we believe it's the contamination issue. Implications. As a criminologist, I am very excited about these implications because I generally study arresting people, right? So you're going to arrest people, you're going to incarcerate them, you're going to put them through the system. And the big takeaway for me as a criminologist is that we can actually do things that don't involve sending people to prison, which has problems in and of itself. So, and it's more cost effective than putting someone through the criminal justice system. So this is something that's definitely worth exploring. And as I mentioned, these are preliminary results. We're still working on getting more data and analyzing the data differently, particularly looking at mowing intensity and looking at trends more longitudinally. And that's all I have. I made it through my time.
Thank you so much, Jessie. So last but not least, Dr. Joe Erardi, who I'm really pleased to introduce to you. As you know, I mean, probably you experienced Sandy Hook changed many people's lives, probably your life as well. And Joe is going to talk about some of the lessons learned since Sandy Hook from his perspective as a superintendent for the past 20 more plus years.
Folks, good morning, and thank you first for the opportunity to be here as a stakeholder. It's an incredible privilege. What I'm hoping that my few minutes in front of you will bring to your attention is how important the research that's happening needs to get to the field of public school leaders. Time is treasure. And what I want to do is take your data points, and I want to try to put faces in front of those data points for you, and for you to recognize how important your work is and how the need to move forward is just, it needs to happen yesterday.
Just after 9:30 this morning, Newtown Police received a 911 call for an emergency at the elementary school. Newtown PD, upon obtaining information as to the stature of the situation, contacted the Connecticut State Police and requested assistance from state police and surrounding local police departments. On and off-duty troopers responded to the school and with Newtown Police, immediately upon arrival, entered the school and began a complete active shooter search of the building. That included checking every door, every crack, every crevice, every portion of that school. Our main objective was to evacuate as quickly and efficiently as possible any and all students and faculty in the school. The entire school was searched. That was accomplished. The staging area was set up. The students and staff were put into that staging area, and soon thereafter, the children and staff were reunited with their parents and their loved ones. There were several fatalities at the scene, both students and staff. There is no information relative to that that is being released at this time until we've made complete proper notification. The shooter is deceased inside the building. There's a great deal of work that is undertaken immediately upon locating the shooter, and that is there's a great deal of search warrant activity, there's a great deal of law enforcement activity both in and out of state to ensure that we cover all the bases relative to that specific individual. Suffice it to say, the scene is secure. State Police Major Crime Squad, Newtown Police Department, Danbury State's Attorney, and many agencies are working together to answer all the questions surrounding exactly what happened.
I apologize for that volume, but boy, do I have your attention, don't I? This was the piece that played to Connecticut school leaders at that moment in 12/14/12, now nearly 7 years ago. I was a school superintendent about 20 miles and 20 minutes from Newtown Public. I was at a point in my career where I was looking for one additional challenge, and I had opportunities to go lots of different places and spaces, and I raised my hand, and I'm so glad that I did, and I was chosen to be the superintendent for Newtown Public Schools. I arrived in Newtown about 9 months after the tragedy. I want to share with you a couple of situations that presented to me immediately. The first meeting in Newtown, prior to my actual start date, I was called by a dad. And the dad opened the conversation with, "Doc, I know you're our new superintendent. I don't know anything about you. We'd like to have you over the house. And with your visit, there'll be a number of impacted families." My first visit, as I entered the living room, had 17 families represented, all with one common denominator, that they had lost their son or daughter. My commitment to Newtown Public and my further commitment to this country, which I think that offers such great education through our public schools, is that we have to get better. We have to get better at school safety. Upon my stay in Newtown, every morning started at 6:30 a.m. with an open hour for the community. Newtown Public Schools, incredibly complex, but the reward that I had from serving as their superintendent was the highlight clearly of my career. I had the privilege of reopening the new Sandy Hook Elementary School. I had the privilege of watching a community that was taken to its knees begin to feel okay about itself. But the lessons learned from Newtown Public, I think, are lessons that this country has yet to pay full attention to. My present work as a consultant for the National Organization of American School Administrators is I go across the country and I share lessons learned and I share best practice in regards to situations that still need to be corrected. And the sad part about the work that I do is that everybody wants to talk about evidence-based, and yet no one has the cadre of evidence behind their belief. I speak to urban school superintendents and public school safety leaders, and they are so endorsing that every school needs to have something which students have to walk through to be searched for weapons, yet there's no evidence. I speak to administrators across the country on their school safety plan, and I share with them that the best safety plan is a plan that's never complete, and they don't understand that. I think what I'm, if I can move my next slide, I don't know if I can. What I believe, and the reason why I so quickly raised my hand to be a part of this work is that what's happening with research scientists, particularly around gun control, is a linchpin of information that school leaders have yet to understand, have yet to be privileged to, have yet to respond to. So what we continue to do is what we believe is best for students from the belly, from the barrel of our belly. And I'm not certain that's the best approach when it comes to school safety and school security. What I'm absolutely certain is that what we've experienced across this country, they are not random acts. Adam Lanza was not a random act. Adam Lanza was an avoidable, horrific crisis in a community of a high-wealth community, in a community that had great partnership to its public schools. How do you allow a postgraduate of their high school to live in the basement of his home with black garbage bags over the window, so no light, anorexic, 6'1", 110 pounds? His only link was his mom. His mom was still alive. She should be incarcerated. Adam Lanza brought to Sandy Hook Elementary School a 12-gauge shotgun. He brought a Bushmaster automatic, semi-automatic, a Glock 10mm handgun, and a 9mm semi-automatic. And he brought enough ammunition to take out the entire school. He left behind in his home more weapons than he brought with him. How does that happen? I think it's really important that school administrators understand one essential question, and boy, I'm hoping research scientists can help us out. And the question really is this: how as a community, as a school community, and as a community, how as a community do we know our most complex student, our most complex parent and staff member, and our most complex community member? That's the question. And how does that play into gun safety? What we have learned since Columbine, through Sandy Hook, through Parkland, and a whole bunch of other tragedies in between those three, is that time truly matters. It took this country over 2 decades to figure out how to do a lockdown drill. It took this country 2 decades to figure out that in Columbine, if you wait for your SWAT team to assemble, no matter how sophisticated, it's too slow. And they moved to the protocol of 1+1 for Newtown, Sandy Hook. And in Parkland, as you know, first up, first in. The combination of great concern is around guns and around the mental health of this country in many different domains. I think part of that has to be putting the team together locally that makes a difference. I stood in front of safety officials, public safety officials, and I shared with them that if they do not have a partnership with their school leadership, either they or that superintendent needs to leave because they have no plan. A safety plan, through my lens, is a plan that's always moving forward. Anybody who tells you that their plan is complete, that's when they're in trouble. So how does your research influence that district team? How do you get the critical pieces that you're discovering to local school districts? And how does that happen sooner than later? Time is treasure. I talk about team members quite often when I speak across the country. And whether it's public or private, whether it's higher education or preschool, it makes no difference. It's all the same plan. And how do we prepare, and what do we do? And how do we respond? The piece that I could spend hours talking to you about, and I'll take a minute, are the solutions that are in place. And where I developed my solutions were from the survivors of Sandy Hook Elementary School. I sat with them for 4 hours on a given day. And very similar to this conference, it wasn't about the media. The doors were closed, the coffee was warm, and the emotions were filling the room. And we talked about simple solutions. Yet those solutions have yet to play across this country with any fidelity at all. Simply locking your door. That was on top of the pile for Sandy Hook. Every classroom door in this country needs to be able to lock from the inside. Pretty simple. Yet there's tens of hundreds of thousands of doors still where folks have to go out in the hallway. Time is treasure. Number the outside of your building. Time is treasure. Someone take ownership. When I speak to school leaders, I speak to an audience where they're nodding their head yes, and I challenge them not to leave the information in the car or on the plane. And who's in charge of school safety in local communities? Who's in charge? I asked the question to school superintendents, do you have an athletic director? And guess what? Every hand goes up. And I asked the same question, do you have a security or safety director? And guess what? About 2/3 of the hands don't go up. So where are our priorities, and how do we reconstitute in order to be a safer community and a safer country? The last thing I'd like to share with you is what I think is most important. That's around courageous conversations. And much of that has to do with gun control and gun safety. I encourage every school leader never to make that decision in isolation. I encourage all voices to be a part of that conversation. I encourage that through a community conversation in every local community. Is there a need for an armed or an unarmed officer? And who should carry in a building? And who shouldn't carry in the building? I have some real strong feelings, I won't share them this morning, around teachers carrying weapons. But there's millions of federal dollars right now being spent to train teachers to do so. And how are we spending our money? The second great lesson learned throughout this country, I believe, is that we spend billions of dollars on post-mortem safety measures, surveillance cameras, metal detectors. This is the future, folks, and there is such a need for your information to come forward to public school leaders and private school leaders and school leaders across the country. I just want to, if I could, underscore for you the importance of what you're doing, how privileged I am to be here, and I share with you my contact information. Unfortunately, the cell phone number, I spoke in Vegas 2 weeks ago and my phone was stolen as I was speaking, so I do have a different number. If you want my cell phone number, just see me during a break. I'll be more than happy to give it to you. But that's my contact, my direct connect for my email. I love to carry on the conversation. And again, I am just incredibly privileged to be here and to be a part of this conversation. Thank you so much.
We are entering the question and answer part of the first session, and I think Lynn is going to read us, or Eleni, yes, they're going to ask each of the panel members, and there's a push button. Okay, great.
Okay. Hello. Okay. This is a question probably for Cheryl. Were Native Americans included in the focus groups in the Upper Peninsula? And if so, has any information been gleaned regarding cultural beliefs around firearm safety and injury prevention in those communities?
So we haven't conducted the focus groups yet, but our intention is to include members of Native American communities. And I think probably in a separate focus group or two, although we haven't actually finalized that, and some of it might have to do with feasibility. But definitely a strong interest. I think people are probably aware that firearm suicide is a fairly high rate, higher in our rural communities than other communities in the U.S., and that among youth, the highest rates of suicides are among our Native American youth.
And what is the role of active shooter drills in schools? What do we know, if anything, about the effect of this practice on children?
First, we know it's very controversial, and that it's encouraged. I'm going to give you the 4 examples to answer the question. On 12/7/12, a week before the Sandy Hook crisis, the principal, Dawn Hawksprung, who was the first to be killed at Sandy Hook, she led a drill for her kinders and her first graders. And she shared with her kinders and first graders, if there's ever a bad thing happening in the building, run out your classroom door, run down the hallway, go through the double doors, and keep running. And I know that there was pushback from parents about, oh my gosh, this is just way too much for kinder and first grade. I also know that in reunification in the Sandy Hook firehouse, when over 30 parents were standing believing their child wasn't coming out, that the 12 students, when the semi-automatic rifle froze, went out the door, down the hall, down a path to safety. I use that example often. There's a great pushback right now in regards to a growing number of parents believing that there's a better way to train. I continue to believe that I'd rather have that conversation with parents and make sure that every child knows of the opportunities in regards to an active shooting drill than to allow people to move away from that drill.
Great. Thank you. Do you think that we'll start to see a decrease in warning signs prior to school shootings in an effort to hide intent now that see something, say something is being taught in schools?
Justin, can you repeat that question?
Essentially, do you think students will be trying to hide their intent and there will be fewer warning signs to report now that this program is in place and kids are aware of it?
I actually wonder if it might be the reverse. And so if you make signs and symptoms salient, do we expect to actually see an increase at first before you might start to see a broader change that might have an effect in actually reducing the number of violent events? But I believe it could be that you're making people more aware. We're hoping to actually increase reporting so that we can be in more preventive, rather than reaction.
Great. And another question about the Say Something program and early outcomes. So far, what is the level of consistency, or what's the level of consistency that students have accurately identified risky behavior related to possible violence? This question asker was worried about the possibility of targeting and inappropriately labeling students of color, for example.
So a lot of the signs and symptoms that they're trying to identify are based on previous literature. So we're looking for the examples that they will use are postings where there are specific threats. They're looking for signs or symptoms of internalizing behavior or depression. So they are trying to draw from examples that are literature-based, evidence-based, and would be applicable to almost any students that are not specific to a particular demographic base. But there does seem to be some, at least, recognition, again, from just more initial training, like immediate recognition of signs. We do see an increase. We've tried to include additional non-examples to see if people are just ticking off, this is an example, this is an example, this is an example, to see if we're actually recognizing fairly consistent signs that you might see.
Great. I think that's the questions we have for this panel. And just a reminder to everyone to send in your questions during the panel. Next panel. Thank you.
Great. Can everybody give a round of applause for our panel, please? I think that was a really great session, and as I reflect on it, I'm struck by not only the breadth of the communities that are affected by child and adolescent firearm injuries, but also the range of solutions that we see, everything from environmental design in urban settings to harm reduction strategies, working with partners, and upstream school safety interventions. And really, as you heard, about the urgency of translating these things into our school settings.